When news of Trayvon Martin's death first broke last February, much of the attention was focused on Florida's Stand Your Ground laws, which allow an individual to, quote, meet force with force if they believe they're in danger. Now, ultimately, Zimmerman and his lawyers chose not to invoke Stand Your Ground in his defense, and it didn't come up in the trial. But Florida's law did become a model for legislation in almost half of the country. So where does that debate over the Stand Your Ground laws go from here, and how does that fit into a broader conversation in our country about the gun debate and gun violence? Let's bring in our guest, Shannon Watts. She is founder of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, Lisa Graves, publisher of AlecExposed.org, and Florida attorney and former prosecutor Ken Padowitz. Thanks so much to all three of you for being here. So,
thank you.
Ken, I want to start with you and get you're my expert here on Florida law. So, why did the defense choose not to pursue Stand Your Ground in this case?
Well, if I was a defense attorney, I would have told my client not to pursue it either. I mean, what happened here, I believe, is a collision of two worlds colliding. One world was the court of ethics and morality, which basically saw a young boy walking home with a bag of candy, talking on a cell phone, and he was pursued by a man that was armed with a firearm who shot and killed him. And in that court, many people, including specifically black Americans, believe that Zimmerman is clearly wrong. The other world is the court of law, and very simply, the jury basically had one thing to consider. Was there a reasonable doubt based on the evidence presented? And I believe that we have these two worlds, and they collided partly due to the Stand Your Ground law, because I believe that separated out these two things, and this is why we have a problem, and the defense clearly didn't want the Stand Your Ground law applied in this case. They didn't want a judge making a decision, possibly losing that. It's an elected judge, and it was very unlikely that a judge is going to rule and dismiss a case of this type in this type of situation. So they didn't want to use that. They wanted to go right to the jury. And, and their strategy obviously worked.
Just as a quick follow-up to you on that, though, Paul, to some degree, if you live in a community or a state where you have Stand Your Ground laws, I mean, I would imagine that impacts how you perceive the situation when you're in the situation and you have a gun and you think you're being threatened, even though it may not be ultimately the way you go with your case, correct? To Ken, sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, yes, I totally agree with that. That's why I'm saying there's this separation of these worlds. Normally, as a homicide prosecutor, when I go into court, I have ethics and the law on my side. But here they were kind of pulled apart because George Zimmerman, having taken these classes, he's under the belief that he can take this loaded gun, he can go out into places that he's allowed to be, he can pursue someone just because of the fact that they're in a hoodie, and he can profile them, and then we have this end result. So, it's not a mistake that the Florida Prosecuting Attorneys Association, which represents all the prosecutors in Florida, want this law repealed. There's a reason for that, and it should be looked at very closely as to why the prosecutors, the conservatives, the people that are with law enforcement want this law repealed in Florida.
So, Lisa, let's talk about this, because it's not just in Florida. Let's talk about how these Stand Your Ground laws, they now exist in some 24, 25, 30 states. There was a study in 2012 by the Tampa Bay Times which showed that a defendant who uses Stand Your Ground is more likely to prevail if the victim was black, and that obviously sparked an investigation by the Civil Rights Commission. But talk to us a little bit about how it is. We've got these laws all over the place. Ken's talking about, there's a desire to repeal them in Florida. How do we deal with them, though, now that they're everywhere?
Well, this was a law that was pushed in Florida by the NRA, and then it was ratified by the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, which is a group that's funded by some of the biggest corporations in the world. And once ALEC ratified that law, they helped push it into law in 24 states, basically in its entirety, and another 10 states partially. And one of the big pieces of that law that have not been discussed is the fact that if the defendant chooses to assert it under that law in a civil suit, if the family of the victim does not prevail, for instance, if in this case in Florida, if Trayvon's family does not prevail in a civil suit and this claim is invoked, under that law, they would be required to pay George Zimmerman's attorney's fees and his lost wages. So it would require the victim's family to pay
pick up the cost, basically.
the killer. Yeah, pay the cost for the killer and pay for the killer's wages. And that's the law in over 24 states in this country now.
Right. And well, and it strikes me that obviously creates something of a check on having to think, do I really want to bring a civil case? Because if we don't think we have the facts and we think we're going to lose, we not only have to pay our own legal bills, as you point out, we've got other legal bills, right? So, Shannon, I want to talk, though, I want to shift to your organization. You work for regulation of guns. How do we balance that? We have a number of these laws in place. There is a gun culture in this country. How do we balance that, though, for people who legally carry them and making sure that we keep our kids and our community safe?
There is a child or teen shot and killed in this country every 3 hours and 15 minutes. I don't think a lot of Americans realize that. We've created a culture that is killing our children and our teens, in addition to the 30,000 Americans who are killed every year. So we have to do something to change this culture. And our organization, Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, was started the day after the Sandy Hook shootings. In just 7 months, we have over 100,000 members in 40 chapters across the country, in 40 states. And so it's time for moms to wake up. And it is time for moms to stand their ground and to say, we will not allow these lax and lenient laws that are resulting in the shooting deaths of our children. Right. And if we get together as 80 million strong, which we are in this country, this is a nonpartisan issue, and ask for common sense reform, we will get it, but we have to act.
Well, and I think the point here, too, is, we've got to act, we've got to understand, as Lisa was pointing out, sort of where these laws come from, and then, as Ken hopefully helped us elucidate, how they are then applied or not applied, utilized at the local level. Thank you to Shannon Watts, Lisa Graves, and Ken Padowitz.